The friendship between Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau has rightly been made much of. Same with Emerson and Walt Whitman. In the case of Emerson and Thoreau, in the case of Emerson and Whitman, there was powerful mutual influence, out of which grew some of the most important literature of 19th century America. By contrast, Emerson's friendship with Margaret Fuller has not been treated as fully. Fortunately for us, in Robert D. Richardson's 1995 biography of Emerson, Mind on Fire, we get a fuller portrait of how these two great minds met and interacted and impacted one another. It's important to note that by the time Emerson met Margaret Fuller, 1836, Emerson was in the middle of his great 1836 Nature, his first and groundbreaking and for many most powerful book. Well, what was Fuller doing? So Margaret Fuller, born in 1810, was 7 years younger than Emerson, born in 1803. Margaret Fuller's father, Timothy Fuller, was a brilliant and driven man who single-handedly educated his 10 children. Perhaps because he identified genius in Margaret at a very young age, he put most of his energy into her. So by the age of 5 or 6, she was already reading Latin. And that sort of intellectual virtuosity continued over the next several years, up until the point where when Emerson met her, she could translate Latin, Greek. She was adept at German, French. She was easily the most well-educated woman in all of America, if not all of Europe and America, and certainly more erudite in terms of mastery of languages, certainly more erudite in terms of volumes read than probably even Emerson himself. And this, of course, was without Fuller ever attending a college. Emerson himself went to Harvard, and Emerson also went to Harvard Divinity School. Even though Fuller very much appreciated this profound and comprehensive education that her father inaugurated, she also, as she admitted in her autobiographical sketch, felt oppressed by her father, that her education was unnatural, that she was not able to grow organically as a flower might, but she was too often kept indoors and too often deprived of sleep, and basically claimed that this ponderous education took life from her and made her what we would call neurotic, someone prone to melancholy, someone prone to nervousness, someone who was seen as somewhat socially awkward, not only because she was obviously intelligent and not afraid to show it, but also because she was used to conversing with books and not so much with people. Now, by 1836, by the time Emerson meets Margaret Fuller, not only has she undergone this thorough education, but also she has become associated with a really interesting movement in New England, Concord, Boston. Bronson Alcott opened his famous Temple School, and he wanted in this school to teach children via conversation, basically to ask children questions, say, about the Gospels, and allow them to respond spontaneously and to react to each other spontaneously. And the idea was that ultimately everyone has within a spark of divinity, and the goal of education is to draw this divinity out. And how can this be done? Through conversation. Fuller was Alcott's assistant at this school. Unfortunately, Alcott published these conversations, and they were scandalous because children, in talking about the Gospels, talked about subjects like, say, reproduction, and this was scandalous to the New England audience, and the school had to shut down. So Fuller in 1836 had some experience as a school teacher. Soon after her meeting with Emerson, she would create her own conversations. She would have women meet at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore in Boston, and she would propose to them a subject, and the women would sit around and converse about the subject, led by Fuller. And this became a way for Fuller to have a salary, but also it certainly enhanced her reputation among the intelligentsia, the literati of the Boston Concord nexus. In 1840, Emerson suggested that she edit The Dial, a groundbreaking transcendentalist magazine that ran for 4 years. Fuller edited it for 2 years herself, 1840, 1842, and eventually others took over, including Emerson, before it closed in 1844. After this, Fuller wrote her famous book, Woman in the 19th Century, her masterpiece, a book that was to her what Emerson's nature was to him. And ultimately, she was offered a very cushy editorial position by Horace Greeley at the New York Daily Tribune, leading newspaper of the time. So that just gives you a sense of Fuller's success as an intellectual. Emerson hears about Fuller from Elizabeth Peabody, a good friend of his, the sister of Sophia Peabody, who would eventually marry Hawthorne. And he hears what a genius Fuller is. Elizabeth Peabody says, well, you should meet her. So she introduces Emerson to this woman. Emerson is living in Concord at this time. He is remarried after the death of his first wife, Ellen Tucker. He's remarried a woman named Lydia Jackson, calls her Lydian. And Fuller comes and stays with him for 3 weeks. Heroic visit, Robert D. Richardson says, if my recollection is accurate. And Fuller, to use our language, is emotionally powerful. She craves intimate friendship. She wants nothing on the surface. She is electric. She is magnetic. She is intuitive. She does nothing by half measure. While Emerson admires her intellect immensely, he's a little scared of her desire for emotional intimacy. So thus begins the relationship, which on the one hand is intellectually satisfying for both of them. Certainly Margaret Fuller, in her own thinking and writing, is applying some of Emerson's ideas, applying some of Emerson's stylistic techniques to her feminist commitments. That's obvious. He inspires her sense that within each of us is divinity. And the goal of life is to bring this divinity to the forefront and manifest it based on your individuality. This idea certainly isn't unique to Emerson, but it's in the air, and it's Emerson's primary idea in nature all the way up through American Scholar self-reliance. And Fuller is drawn to this idea, and it very much influences her Woman in the 19th Century. What do we get from Fuller to Emerson? Well, Emerson is prone to abstraction. He's deeply read in Plato and the Neoplatonics. He's enamored of ideas. And if you've read Emerson, you know that his style can feel pretty abstract. If you read Nature in particular, it's sometimes pretty heavy going if you haven't read your Plato or your Neoplatonics, your Plotinus or your Proclus or Iamblichus, say. Fuller encouraged Emerson to be more personal. She encouraged Emerson to be more vulnerable, we might say. She encouraged him to write less from the mind and more from the heart. So the warmth we get in an essay like Nature, where Emerson alludes to the death of his brother, where Emerson nods to his sorrows, the intimacy we get in a later essay like, say, Experience, 1844, where Emerson laments the death of his boy Waldo, age 5, from scarlet fever. I'm not saying this is all Margaret Fuller is doing, but certainly she called forth in Emerson an emotional vulnerability that perhaps he might not have expressed had he not spent time with her. So from 1836 up until 1845, when Fuller leaves to go to New York to write for Greeley, the two spend a lot of time together. They remain close, but there's a sense that they also vex each other. Now, we don't have direct evidence of this, but we see Emerson write about experiences with a woman, and we see Fuller write about experiences with a man. They suggest that this is the dynamic of the relationship. Fuller craves intimacy with Emerson, maybe even intimacy that's a little inappropriate in Lydian's eyes. I mean, there's some think that Lydian was threatened by Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller wanted all of Emerson, not sexually, but she wanted all of him emotionally. And Emerson was certainly drawn to this. The two took very long walks together, just the two of them. They would sometimes go walking late at night together, just the two of them. So Emerson was clearly stimulated by the intimacy and sexuality that Margaret Fuller offered him. But he could only go so far. He would pull back. Now, why would he pull back? Did he pull back because of his own sense of, I don't want to share anymore? Did he pull back because ultimately he valued intellect over emotion? Margaret Fuller said he had a cold intellect. Did he pull back because he felt Lydian wanted him to pull back? For whatever reason, he could not give Margaret Fuller exactly what she wanted, and this led to frustration from her. It seems that Emerson ultimately concluded that she was more difficult than anything else because she would pressure him to give something he wasn't ready to give. What about Fuller? Clearly, she wanted a commitment from Emerson, an emotional commitment from Emerson that he was not able to give. And she, over time, probably saw him less as a mentor, less as a hero, than as someone who had expressed traditional masculine values in a way that was somewhat disappointing to her. So even though the two influenced each other's art, influenced each other's thought, they ultimately had a vexed relationship. However, when Margaret Fuller died, tragically, Emerson had some really powerful things to say. Margaret Fuller, in the late 1840s, sailed to Europe. Horace Greeley paid her to be a foreign correspondent, and she ended up in Italy reporting on the wars of concerning the Roman Republic. There she fell in love with a Count Asoli. They had a child, and they decided to sail back to America in 1850. When they got off the coast of Fire Island, when they got off the coast of Fire Island, New York, they could see the shore. But then a storm broke out, and the ship got caught on a sandbar. The pilot of the ship was the first mate. The captain had died earlier in near Spain, I think. Not sure, of smallpox. The ship got caught on the sandbar, a storm hit, and the ship could not become free of the sandbar, and the ship sank. And Fuller and Asoli and their child died. Emerson, as is well known, went out to visit the tomb of Ellen Tucker several months after she died. She died young of tuberculosis, broke Emerson's heart. In this case, Emerson did not risk seeing the body of a loved one again. He sent Thoreau, his young protege, sent Thoreau out to the coast of Fire Island, said, look for any remains of Margaret. Her body was not washed up. Look for any belongings, such as her writings from Rome. These were not discovered. But it seems that Emerson did not want to risk seeing the body of a loved one again, so he sent Thoreau instead to search for remains. Soon after Margaret Fuller died, Emerson said, in her I've lost my audience. So that says it all. In her I've lost my audience. That he saw in Margaret Fuller an intellectual equal, if not an intellectual superior, and he saw in her the perfect recipient of his ideas, the perfect recipient of his style, and in losing her, he lost his closest, most intimate intellectual companion. So it remains in some ways still a story to be written. Maybe more documents could arise, could be discovered. But I would say that Emerson's relationship with Margaret Fuller is ultimately more important than his relationship with Thoreau. He was pretty much a mentor for Thoreau from the very beginning. And when Thoreau started writing in his own style, say in Walden, Emerson often found it to be too baroque, too paradoxical, too attuned to the desire to be witty. Whitman, too. Whitman saw as kind of a protege, and even though he admired Whitman, he also found Whitman's emphasis on sexuality to be somewhat vulgar. But in Fuller, he found a true equal in mind, and if not in heart. And it's really a moving story that tells us a lot about the virtues of each of these writers. What separates Fuller from Emerson is, say, in Woman of the 19th Century, her openness to spontaneity, flux, play, unpredictability. There's a sense in her writing that anything can happen. And there's an openness, a heterogeneity, a diversity, a fecundity to it. And not that Emerson doesn't have these traits as well, but with Emerson, there's also a sense that there is an Emersonian I, a subjectivity that controls the essays, an I that we are invited to admire. This I marks Emerson's power as someone who can speak his individuality, but this I, and its desire for rhetorical control, might also suggest a coldness of heart. Whereas Fuller's heterogeneous, collaborative, polyvocal, open, playful, improvisational style certainly shows someone more open to the fluxes of the heart than, say, Emerson, but might at the same time be afraid to impose a more commanding eye on her work, which may lead, for some people, to a diffuseness that lacks the cogency of the Emersonian individualism. So, Emerson and Fuller.